Hello, everyone. I'm Joanne Knowlton Gabriel on behalf of the Darien Library. We welcome you to our four-part Mozart series with Gil Harel. Gil returns this evening to continue with our third lecture entitled Mozart and the Concerto, Revolution in the 18th Century. We will learn about many of the tantalizing works he composed during this era, including many of his piano concerti, recognized as some of his greatest achievements. And we will watch as Mozart ascends to the full height of his powers as a composer and dramatist. Before we begin, I would like to mention that programs at Darien Library are made possible by the annual Friends of the Library campaign. We thank you for your support to make programs like this possible and our collections available to the community. Our presenter this evening is a professor of musicology and music theory at Naugatuck Valley Community College, where he also conducts the chorale, capella ensemble, and is the music director of theater productions. His many honors include a Distinguished Teaching Award from Baruch College and the Exemplary Service Award from MVCC. In his spare time, he performs as a pianist and vocalist. Please welcome Dr. Gil Harel.
Thank you so much, Joanne, and thank you to all of our guests for joining this evening. We're here to talk about Mozart at the full height of his powers. Mozart, the second half of the 1780s. He's going to turn 30 years old in 1786, and tragically, he has just about 5 years left on the clock before he meets an untimely and premature demise at the very end of 1791. And yet, in these last 5 or 6 years, he's churning out what posterity would regard as one masterpiece after another. Today, we're going to focus on a particular genre that is sometimes overlooked, and that's the concerto. Why is it overlooked? Well, I think it's fair to say that in the context of the 18th century, the most prominent genres that came to fill the concert halls and ultimately the music history textbooks, we'd have to start with the symphony. The symphony was sort of the ultimate product of the late Enlightenment in music. And this coincided in economic developments, namely the rise of a middle class with a disposable income that could go and buy tickets to see a work performed. Perhaps a symphony, perhaps a string quartet, but most likely it would be a larger scale work. That is to say, chamber music, what we call chamber music, string quartets and works that would be performed by smaller ensembles without a conductor, would have been performed really in someone's living room or perhaps in an aristocratic salon, but not in the big concert halls. In the concert halls, it was all about the symphony. However, there is a connection between the symphony and the concerto. The concerto, you could think of it as a related genre because it involves the full symphonic orchestra. It also, of course, involves, well, the concerto soloist. The verb concertare in Latin means to struggle against or to oppose. And therefore, at the core of a concerto lies an opposition, a duality, a dichotomy. And that opposition is essentially between the full orchestra, the orchestra we might see and hear if we were to attend a symphony, as well as a soloist. The soloist is therefore playing in a kind of dialogue with the rest of the orchestra, sometimes echoing music that has already been introduced, playing themes and spinning them around with variation, sometimes introducing new themes, sometimes extemporaneously creating music that has a fantasia-like quality. That's in a section of the piece called the cadenza, not to be confused with the credenza. Well, that would be a piece of furniture, as we know. What was Mozart's life like in this period, let's say starting in 1785 or 86? Well, he was incredibly busy writing at a feverish pace. Remember that Mozart, though he dies shy of his 36th birthday, is going to leave posterity with an enormous catalog, what we call the Köchel catalog, named after the musicologist who compiled these works in the 19th century, an Austrian musicologist named Köchel. And in the Köchel catalog, we have 626 pieces. Let me repeat that. In the catalog, for a composer who died in his mid-30s, he had bequeathed unto posterity over 600 works. This is a staggering figure, and for comparison, we might look at Beethoven, who was born just about 15 years after Mozart. Beethoven's going to die, and his opus numbers are going to go up to 135. This is, in a way, comparing apples and oranges, because, of course, even though they were 15 years apart, they had very different mentalities and essentially they would come to represent different eras. Mozart representing the high classical period, the end of the Enlightenment, and Beethoven representing the classical period to an extent and the Enlightenment era to a lesser degree. But really, in late Beethoven, we see essentially the manifestation of a style which posterity would later describe as romanticism. And while Beethoven's music early in his career evinced the influence of the Enlightenment period, an influence we'll discuss at length this evening, Beethoven would later write music that might even be described as anti-classical, that is to say, anti-Enlightenment, proto-romantic, incredibly expressive in a way that often, musically speaking, eschews the traditional harmonic patterns and chord progressions of the late 18th century in favor of wholly new avenues forward in music. It's also worth pointing out that Beethoven lived to be about 20 years older than Mozart was at the time of his death. That is to say, Beethoven was 56 in a few months. Mozart was about a month shy of his 36th birthday. So if anything, that just, I think, puts the numbers into very, very stark relief. Mozart's catalog, 626 works, Beethoven, 135 works, and these are composers born about 14 years apart. So it's quite remarkable. Mozart, prolific. Where was he living at this time? Well, the answer really is all over the place in this city of Vienna, where he had moved. He talked about how Mozart, chafing under the rather abrasive, dictatorial and tyrannical and draconian rule of his boss in his hometown of Salzburg, the Archbishop Hieronymus Colloredo, Mozart decided to break with the Archbishop, to break with his boss, and eventually to break with his own father. And you'll recall that we discussed Mozart basically striking out as what we would now call a freelance musician, somebody who worked by being paid through honoraria, that is to say, commissions. Mozart, write me this, whatever it was, this piano sonata, and I will give you a commission. Sometimes Mozart would write the piece hoping for a commission, and he wouldn't get it. Mozart would also teach lessons, although like many composers and many musicians in general, pedagogy was not in his blood, and he did not typically enjoy teaching lessons. When he had an especially precocious student, he didn't seem to mind it as much. But generally speaking, Mozart did not have favorable things to say about his students. And even when he did, he had a student named Barbara Auenhammer, who was incredibly talented and in fact played many of Mozart's works, including some of his concerti. And Mozart couldn't seem to resist describing her in a letter as being profoundly gifted at the keyboard and also profoundly homely. Not a very nice thing of Mozart to have written, but again, I'm sure he had no idea that his letters would become essentially part of an enshrined collection, part of the annals of music history as they did. So, what can we say about his finances at this time? This is a really interesting question, and one that we'll revisit in December when we have our fourth and final lecture in this series. It's often been suggested, and I think many people in the general population who have some vague understanding of Mozart's life and his biography have it in their heads that Mozart was dirt poor at the end of his life, that he was in debt, and that he basically couldn't afford to put food on the table, that sort of thing. And that mythology should be dispelled because it is completely apocryphal. It's not wrong to say that Mozart was in debt because, in fact, he was. And we know he would have to borrow money, and he borrowed money freely, especially from his Masonic brothers in the lodge that he had joined in Vienna. We'll talk about that momentarily. But it's also important to point out that Mozart was making a lot of money at this point in his life. By 1789, the economy is going to crash for musicians because the emperor dies shortly after the start of the next decade. And that was really disastrous for musicians because when the monarch died, that meant that performances were suspended, at least for a period of state mourning, which could last 6 months or longer. And that meant no opera. The symphonic performances and concerto performances would have been affected. So that was a sort of fallow year, but by the last year of Mozart's life, he's making a fortune compared to earlier in his life. And in fact, had Mozart lived even another couple of years, he would have amassed quite a fortune. To give you some numbers, in his last year, Mozart is estimated to have earned something close to 4,000 florins, which was a lot of money back then. If you compare it to the salary of a typical court functionary, they might have gotten paid 250 or perhaps 400 florins. So Mozart's making, let's say, 10 times what the average court functionary is making. In fact, when he leaves Salzburg about a decade prior, he's making a tenth of that. He's making 450 florins in the title of court organist. So financially, he's doing quite well. Mozart's problem was that he just spent above his means. That is to say, it's not how much you make, it's how much you save. And Mozart, like many people, it seems, had trouble saving money. So the idea that he was poor is totally erroneous. Um, what we have to understand is that Mozart spent, and he spent, it must be said, sometimes recklessly. Mozart was something of a dandy. That is to say, he liked to look good, and he was probably quite vain about that. He loved the latest fashion, three-cornered hats, vests, cufflinks, things of that nature. And he spent freely on it. He also spent freely on the apartments he rented, some of which were quite lavish. And the last apartment that the Mozart family was living in had 6 bedrooms. What on earth did they need 6 bedrooms for? They had live-in help, maids that actually slept under the very same roof and kept things tidy and looked after the children. There were 2 of them at that time, at the time of Mozart's death. One about 5 years old and the other less than a year, about 6 months old. So generally speaking, Mozart had the ability to provide amply for his family, but certain decisions he made along the way um, curtailed the ability to pay his bills. But the fact or the notion that Mozart was poor or that his family was somehow subjected to privation is completely false. In fact, the opposite is true. The fact that they lived so well, that Mozart dressed so well, and that they lived in such a lavish apartment, and they had maids, and that his wife was able to partake of the most expensive therapies and spa treatments and things like that. Constanza had a number of health maladies which necessitated that she seek treatment, and she went to the most expensive and to the most indulgent places in some cases. So the fact that the Mozart family lived so well is exactly why Mozart was in debt. So was he in debt? Yes. Was he poor? By no means. Was the Mozart family living beyond their means? Certainly. Did Mozart make decisions which could be described as fiscally irresponsible? Absolutely. But the idea that he was destitute or somehow, living with privation, subjecting his own family to privation is totally erroneous. And this mythos has been promulgated and sustained by movies like Amadeus. Amadeus is great; it gets a lot of things right, but it does, while it doesn't state it outright, it makes Mozart seem, desperate for money, and he was interested in earning money. But at the same time, it must be said that for Mozart, had he made better decisions, to say, had he lived not a miserly life, but had he lived a more practical lifestyle, he would not have had those issues. Let's go ahead and talk about some of the really watershed pieces from this period. There are a number of concerti written in this period. Now, I started by saying that the concerto is sometimes overshadowed by the symphony. I think that's true. Most people would probably be more familiar with concerto repertoire, with symphonic repertoire, than with concerto repertoire. The truth is that Mozart had written most of his symphonies before he moved to Vienna. In fact, 3/4 of them were written before he moved. So his time in Vienna, and especially this period I'm discussing now, the last 5 or 6 years of his life, he was primarily occupied with writing concerti. To be sure, he had a number of symphonies yet to be written, including the magnificent 40th Symphony in G minor and the forward-looking and startlingly expressive polyphonic ending of his symphonic journey, which is Symphony number 41, later called the Jupiter Symphony. So Mozart is not done with symphonic music. He's going to revisit it, and we ourselves will revisit it when we have our final program in December. But he's going to spend most of this time writing concerti. And there are a number of reasons for this. First of all, what kind of concerti was he writing? The answer is piano concerti. And at this point in his career, we can say piano. Earlier in his life, it would have been more correct to have said keyboard concerti because Mozart, as we know, grew up playing not the piano but the harpsichord. However, at this point, but in fact, by the time he's writing really any of his piano concerti, they really are piano concerti. Some of his earlier keyboard works may be just that, keyboard works intended to be played on a harpsichord, but his concerti are really written to showcase the expressive spectrum that a piano was capable of showcasing. I should say, a pianist was capable of showcasing. Piano is just an instrument, right? So he's going to write many piano concerti, and the total number there in the Kirchhoff catalog is 27, which is a significant number. Some of you will know that Beethoven wrote 5 piano concerti, Brahms wrote 2. Mozart wrote 27, and the last 7 or 8 especially are really remarkable works, some of them incredibly forward-looking, some of them un-Mozartian in a way, and I'll describe why that is when we look at the Piano Concerto number 20 in D minor. Other things that are worth pointing out about the piano concerti is that Mozart would often write these pieces because they could serve as a vehicle for showcasing his own talent. Remember, he's not only getting paid on commission, he's also getting paid for performances. And Mozart was a versatile and prolific performer. The pianos of that day were far more mobile than a modern piano, certainly. They weighed a lot less. They were not as sturdy in construction. That was advantageous for Mozart. And so there are stories about his piano getting moved around, taken out of his apartment, and people would carry it essentially. 3, strapping guys would carry it to wherever the gig was. And these gigs were all over the place. They weren't necessarily in concert halls. Some of them were outside. Some of them, quite a few of them, in fact, were performed of all places, and I'm not making this up, in a casino. And Mozart, at one point in his life, was living above a casino, and so it was very convenient for him because there were lots of performances downstairs, and all he would have to do is take his piano downstairs to the casino for gigs, essentially. It's sort of weird to think about us having a concerto played in a casino today. Who could imagine going into the Bellagio or the MGM Grand and seeing an orchestra with a pianist ready to strike up the first movement of a concerto, but nonetheless, that was the case back then. So these pieces were performed often by Mozart himself in the role of soloist and conductor. In fact, the concerto we're about to listen to, number 20, was performed at a time that coincided with a visit from none other than Leopold Mozart, Mozart's dad. And as you'll recall, Mozart's relationship with his father was, well, filled with tension, and it must be said, to some degree at least, bitterness, I think, resentment, and perhaps even at this point, a touch of acrimony. Mozart and his father were as close as two human beings can be in Mozart's youth. Remember, Mozart traveled throughout Europe. He visited France, he visited England, he spent time in Italy, Germany, obviously, all over Austria. And the whole time he was on the road, his father was his constant companion, teaching him everything he knew, supervising his early compositions, introducing him to various aristocratic audiences and workaday musicians all over Europe. Mozart worshipped his father. But as we saw in our last lecture, when we talked about Mozart, his break with the archbishop, his father really let him down there because his father took the side of the archbishop. He basically wrote to Mozart and says, "How dare you leave the archbishop? We owe this man so much. You're so insolent. You have to beg for your job back." And Mozart was like, "Brah, leave me alone. I don't want to live in Salzburg. I don't want to live under the archbishop. I don't want to work for him. I don't want to, be in a town that doesn't have a thriving operatic culture. I want to be in the imperial capital. I want to be in Vienna." And Daddy Mozart, Leopold, just didn't get it. It's also worth pointing out that Leopold Mozart was a devious and dishonest man when it came to money. And all of the money that the Mozart children had earned him in those early tours when they were gallivanting around Europe in the 1760s and into the early 70s, Leopold had basically uh, stockpiled it away, didn't tell his kids about any of it. And in fact, he lied to them and would often present himself as being poor and down on his luck and in desperate need of money. It was very weird, to be honest. When you read it, it's hard to make heads or tails of why Leopold Mozart was so emotionally manipulative, other than to say that he was just a very flawed and perhaps psychologically off in that particular department when it came to parenting. Mozart's father was a control freak, a megalomaniac even, and when it came to the treatment of his son, just downright mean on many occasions. So Leopold Mozart comes to visit Vienna at this time. It'll be the first time he visits Vienna after Mozart visits, or I should say after Mozart moves there. And it'll be the last time he visits because Leopold Mozart's not long for the world. He'll be dead about a year and a half after his return to Salzburg. He was in his 60s, by the way. So for that time, he was thought to have lived a very long and robust life. If you lived to be in your mid 60s, that was pretty good for someone born in the 1720s, as Leopold Mozart was. All right, let's get to the concerto in D minor. Mozart's father was there for the premiere, so the timing was very auspicious, serendipitous, you might even say, that Leopold got to hear it. And it's good for posterity because Leopold's going to write a letter to Nannerl, Mozart's sister and Leopold's daughter. And he's going to say, I heard your brother play a concerto yesterday, and it was really striking and really one of the finest pieces I've ever heard of his. So for Leopold to lavish that kind of effusive praise tells us something, which is that Leopold must have been blown away by this piece because he was very parsimonious with his words of praise. Leopold Mozart, a notoriously miserly man, especially when it came to praise. And here he lavishes ample praise upon his son for writing this remarkable piece. There are a few things about this concerto which are unusual. We'll get to them. First, I see we have a question here. Since Mozart was making a plethora of money in the latter years of his life, did he ever pay off his debts? Did he die in debt? Or is his family responsible for those debts? Great question. We'll talk about this in detail in the December lecture, but it's I think worth our time to talk a little bit about it since it came up. No, Mozart did not finish paying off his debts, and he was in debt to a number of individuals at this time, mostly to a guy named Mikhail Puchberg, who was a merchant and a brother of his in the Masonic Lodge, the Neugekrönten Hoffnung, New Crowned Hope, in Vienna. But fortunately for his family, his wife, Constanza, was an incredibly intelligent, savvy, and no-nonsense woman who quickly archived his works and put on a series of benefit concerts that earned her a small fortune. She would later be involved with the creation of Mozart's first biography. In fact, it's a little bit awkward, but some of you may know this. Mozart, his widow, wound up marrying a guy who would go on to be Mozart's first biographer. So just think about that for a minute. Imagine the scenario. Constanza Mozart is living with her new husband, and her new husband is asking her questions about her old husband to write a book about him. I guess that might be awkward to some, perhaps more awkward today than it was then. Off we go to Concerto number 20 in D minor. Something about the concerto which immediately grabs our attention is the fact that it is in minor. The dichotomy in music between major and minor is a very famous one that anybody can point out, irrespective of your musical training. That is to say, you don't have to have an advanced degree in music to hear something and say, ooh, that sounds like it's in a minor key, or that sounds like it's in a major key. And the way we know this is that we hear that in minor there is a plaintive tone, something that evokes sadness or lamentation, something that evokes grief or perhaps despair. Minor keys don't have to be associated with that, but they often are, and most people will hear it that way. Major keys, contrastingly, are the opposite, essentially, in terms of affectation. They leave us often feeling imbued with a sense of euphoria, perhaps triumph, perhaps victory. Perhaps we associate major keys simply with sunshine and smiles and that sort of positive, hopeful affect. There are exceptions to this, but for the most part, that rule holds true for most listeners. And in the classical period, in the Enlightenment period, remember I talked at the beginning of the program about this new musical culture in which lay listeners, people who work as tailors or cobblers or wainwrights or whatever, can take their hard-earned money, their disposable income, and go buy a ticket to the symphony. The rise of the middle class gives rise to public concerts, and this is a remarkable development in European history. So the thing is, if you've got a paying audience, you want them to like your music, right? You want them to go home happy. So the way you do that, at least one of the ways you do that, is you write overwhelmingly in major keys. And make no mistake about it, composers in the classical period overwhelmingly preferred major keys. Mozart wrote 41 symphonies, 39 are in major. Of the 27 piano concerti, only 2 are in minor. Of his 19 piano sonatas, only 2 are in minor. Of his 5 violin concerti, exactly 0 are in minor. So Mozart overwhelmingly preferred major keys. So did Haydn. Haydn wrote 106 symphonies, 95 of them are in major keys. It's a staggering percentage. By contrast, by the way, we could look at Beethoven. And if you think about Beethoven, so many of his most famous works are in minor keys, right? His Pathetique sonatas in C minor, the Moonlight Sonata in C sharp minor, the Tempest Sonata in D minor, the Fifth Symphony is in C minor, the Ninth Symphony is really in D minor until the last movement. The Opus 111, his final piano sonata, is in C minor. His Opus 131 string quartet is in C sharp minor. Opus 132 is in A minor. So for Beethoven, minor keys held a kind of expressive power that he loved to tap into. I think it's fair to make that claim. For Mozart, a minor key was a sort of exotic beast that we rarely encounter in the catalog. But Concerto number 20 gives us a great example of Mozart writing in minor. It's not a coincidence that of the next generation of Beethoven and the proto-romantics, that is to say Schubert and later on composers born in the first decade or so of the 19th century with names like Mendelssohn and Chopin, they loved the Mozart piano concerto in D minor. For them, this was sort of, demonic music. It's only in art where suffering is somehow considered to be a good thing. Have you ever noticed that? And in music, that's certainly the case. The Romantics loved minor keys because they associated it with suffering, with sort of challenges that had to be surmounted, and that sort of notion. And so they loved this concerto. For Beethoven, this was Mozart's most intriguing concerto. Let's go ahead and listen to it. It's really remarkable to think about the performance of this piece. Mozart wrote it at a time when, as I mentioned, he was very, very busy. And because he was so incredibly busy, he simply didn't have time to copy out all the parts. And that's really, that's a practical consideration. When you're writing for orchestra, you have to copy out the parts for the violinist, violist, cello, bass, the woodwind instruments, the horns, etc., the percussion. Back then, it would have been a kettle drum, or what we would now call a timpani. When you have to write out all those parts and you don't have time, what do you do? Well, we know what happened when Mozart got around to writing this concerto. He got wind that he was going to have a gig, and that none other than Emperor Joseph II was going to be in attendance. He already knew his father was going to be there. So now he's got to finish this concerto, knowing that his father and the emperor are going to be in attendance. In other words, he's got a good reason to impress them. So he's feverishly copying out all the parts. And he goes to the performance. There's one part he did not have a chance to finish. You could probably guess what it was. Well, if you were thinking it was the piano part, you're right. Well, does that mean what we think some of you are guessing it means? Yes, it means that Mozart sat down at the keyboard to play this piano concerto, and he didn't have a complete copy of the piano score in front of him, which meant that when he got to the third movement, to the rondo, the guy had to essentially conjure the notes out of his memory. Think about that. That's an absolutely, it's a crazy and insane feat of genius. The hippocampus, the part of our brain that stores memories, It doesn't work that way for most people. And yet Mozart was able to do it, and we know that the performance went brilliantly because not only did Mozart's father love it, but the emperor himself was apparently bellowing, "Bravo, bravo!" And for the emperor to cup his hands and shout to the performer was a sign of an especially favorable reaction. We're going to jump in. I'm skipping the what's called the first part of the exposition. We'll jump into where the keyboard enters. Now, you may have to turn your volume up here because the performance here, which is featuring the Frankfurt Radio Symphony Orchestra with the Estonian conductor Paavo Järvi and the German pianist Christopher Park performing, it's mixed a little bit low, so you may have to turn up your speakers here. But here we go with Mozart's Concerto in D minor. We'll just listen to a little bit of the first movement, and then we'll skip to the end. I'm going to pause it here. This is a very long concerto, and we won't have time to listen to everything. But my friends, do yourselves a favor. Listening to it will do far more justice to the music than my words ever could. We're going to skip now to the third movement, which starts with a sort of demonic racing theme in the keyboard, which outlines what we call diminished seventh chord. So it's especially crunchy, I guess we would say, to use the parlance of musicians. I'm going to pause it there. This kind of fiery quality to the piano playing is actually written into the score that Mozart would eventually copy out that he never had a chance to copy before the actual premiere of the piece. And this vacillation of dynamics, the loud and soft contrast that we get oscillating through what we call piano and forte dynamics, and the almost malleable flexibility to the timing, to the tempo, that is to say, very proto-romantic. This is anticipating a style that would reach its full maturation in the late works of Beethoven and would be carried forward in the works of Chopin and Schumann, and of course in Wagner and others of the mid to late 19th century. But to hear it in Mozart, very unusual indeed. It's no surprise that this concerto became a favorite for so many of the coming generations. For Beethoven specifically, we know he greatly admired this piece, and many commentators have pointed out that Beethoven's third piano concerto, which is in the key of C minor, is in many ways indebted to Mozart's 20th. So this is a piece that has certainly left its imprint not only on scores, legions of Mozart fans who rank it, I think, consistently among the best and favorite of all his concerti, but also going back 200 years to the time of Beethoven, where this music was especially worshipped for its, again, almost prophetic quality. We move on now. Again, I would recommend for those who are interested, do yourself a favor, listen to the entire concerto. We had to skip the second movement, which is a glorious romanze in B flat major, and one of the sweetest sounding of all of the slow movements in Mozart's catalog. All right, question now in chat. Another David asks, so who wrote down the third movement's piano part? Well, Mozart had to copy it out after the piece, but he only copied it out at that point for his records and for his archives. Mozart wrote music so quickly that it's almost hard to believe it in some cases. There's a famous example of Mozart writing a work for a family friend in Salzburg, a family known as the Hafner family. And of the Hafner family, there was a son in that family named Sigismund, who was about Mozart's age, and they were friendly growing up. And in the 1770s, Mozart wrote a whole suite of chamber music for the Hafner family, for his friend Sigismund specifically, and he called it the Hafner Serenade. Years later, Mozart would write home to his father to ask him to send some old scores, and he was, writing another piece for the Hafner family at this point when Sigismund was elevated to the aristocracy. And so he asks Leopold, he writes him a letter, says, can you send me some of the scores, that are at home, essentially? And Leopold sends it to him. And Mozart later commented in a return letter how he was leafing through the Hafner Serenade, and he had absolutely no memory of ever writing it. This is like 35 minutes of music for for a string orchestra, essentially, with some wind and a couple of brass instruments. And he had no memory of it. He had, for all intents and purposes, never seen it before. Can you imagine writing something of that scope and not having any memory of it? It's quite remarkable. So he just improvised it at the performance, and then he wrote it down later. And Sasha says, "I bet Harry Styles could do it." Yeah, absolutely. It's regular Mozart, that Harry Styles. All right, let's talk about another important development in Mozart's life, this time in the 1780s. Here we have an oil painting, which was thought to have captured a scene in Mozart's own lodge. That thesis has been called into question by modern scholars, but nonetheless, it may as well be what Mozart's lodge looked like. Mozart joined the Freemasons 7 years prior to his death in 1784. He joined. And you can see here that the Masons met in secrecy. Notice there are no windows in the room, so this was very much a closed door, furtive society that admitted members. If you were going to receive an invitation to join a lodge, you had to be connected. And in the case of an artist like Mozart, it's not hard to see how he would have been invited to join. The Masons prized art and music, especially, among the top of the artistic disciplines. And the reason they loved it so much was because it was so abstract, you see. In other words, it's not, paintings are great, but when you listen to music, listen to a symphony, you have to use your imagination to think about what it could be about. And therefore, to the Masons, that sort of that esoteric and abstract quality represented a sort of a beauty and an inimitable quality that the other arts could only approximate. So Mozart was very well connected. He was invited to join the Zur Wohltätigkeit Lodge in Vienna. There were 7 or 8 lodges at the time that he joined. Wohltätigkeit, by the way, in German means beneficence. And what were some of the things about Masonry that would have attracted Mozart? This is an important question to ask. Well, first and foremost, it's worth pointing out that Mozart was really drawn to the rationalist aspect of Masonic ideology. What I mean by that is that Mozart, even though he was a baptized Catholic, he was not an in-the-pews Catholic who was, adhering to church dogma the way a Catholic might have adhered 100 years prior, or even 50 years prior. For example, we know that in Bach's day, Bach was a pietist Lutheran, an extremely religious man. By today's standards, he would have been considered a hysterical fanatic, maybe even a lunatic. And the reason I say that is because much of Bach's music meditates on human sinfulness and human frailty and going to hell, and please, Jesus, don't let me go to hell. There are many of his Bach's cantatas deal with precisely this theme. There's even a cantata number 179, Siehe zu, dass deine Gottesfurcht nicht Heuchelei sei. See to it that your fear of God isn't hypocrisy. Mozart was not like that at all. And it must be said that in general, European society had shifted away from that pietist, dogmatic adherence to the faith as it had been practiced in previous generations. The Masons, in some way, were, not just in some way, but in a very pronounced way, were in direct opposition to church teachings. They, for example, challenged long-held beliefs about the hierarchical organization of society, much of which was intertwined with religion, as you'll recall. The whole idea of the monarch whose reign is divinely inspired. There are going to be monarchs in this period who were very confused. Joseph II was one of them. He firmly believed himself to be sort of a divinely anointed king of Europe, or prince of Europe, a prince capital P. But he was also a product of the Enlightenment, Joseph was. So what were some of the Enlightenment era beliefs that Mozart would have held fast to? Number one, Mozart would have really embraced the idea of a meritocracy, of a society where promotion is based on talent, where advancement in society, and therefore wealth, is based on one's ability to either create something or produce something which has a high value and a value that is agreed upon um, as being inimitable. So, in the case of his music and his compositions and his performances, Mozart knew he was the best. He knew that he was the best performer in Europe. He knew he was the best composer. Even Haydn himself, by the way, when he met Mozart and he met his father, he said, "I say to you before God, as an honest man, your son is the greatest living composer known to me." So Mozart knew all these things, and yet he must have looked at his proverbial bank account and wondered, why he wasn't getting further ahead. So what the Masons were espousing, namely the idea of meritocracy, of a society based on merit, would have appealed very, very much to Mozart. What are some other things that would have appealed to Mozart? Well, I think it's fair to say that Mozart, like many Europeans at this time, was chafing at the, well, call it what it was, the, in many cases, oppressive and draconian rule inflicted upon them by the monarchs that I just alluded to a moment ago. This was especially true in France, right? And recall that Mozart joins the Masons in 1784. By 1789, the summer, in July, the Bastille will be stormed and the French Revolution will be set off. So the timing here is very important. It's not a coincidence that Mozart will live to see the French Revolution begin. In fact, some of his later operas are really going to deal with the abuses of the aristocracy. And I'll just name two of them right now. For those who know Le Nozze di Figaro, 1786, The Marriage of Figaro, the hero of the story is not Count Almaviva, the count, that is to say, the aristocrat, the lord of the manor. It's Figaro, a barber, a simple servant. He's the one who outwits, outsmarts, and ultimately humiliates his aristocratic master. A year later, Mozart would release what is argued by many to be his greatest opera, Don Giovanni. Giovanni is the title character, but he's not a heroic character. In fact, he's the opposite. He is a malfeasant character. Giovanni is loathsome. He is human iniquity incarnate. Giovanni has almost no redeeming qualities other than his lustrous singing voice. Some of the deeds he commits, well, he starts the opera in Act 1, Scene 1 with a murder. He kills the commendatore. Later on, he's going to lie to Donna Elvira and sort of foist her off on his servant Leporello. This is after he's taken her to bed and used her and discarded her like so much rubbish. Later on in the act, he's going to try to seduce a virgin on her wedding night. Zerlina is going to be seduced by Giovanni. So you can see how Enlightenment ideology creeps into Mozart's operas, and nowhere is his association with the Masons more obvious than in his final opera, 1791's Die Zauberflöte, the Magic Flute, an opera that we may have time to talk about in our December lecture. So that's just a little bit about Mozart joining the Masons. Now, why do I mention the Masons? I mention the Masons because a couple of Mozart's most important works in the concerto format are going to be written specifically for people that he meets through Freemasonry. One of those individuals was a clarinetist by the name of Anton Stadler. What do we know about this Stadler guy? Well, the truth is, from what we know about him, he too was not exactly a good guy. He wasn't nearly as malfeasant as Don Giovanni, not as sinister and criminal, really. However, I think we could probably describe Anton Stadler, Mozart's Freemason buddy and one of the most brilliant clarinetists of the day, perhaps the most brilliant clarinetist of the day. We could describe him as a bit of a rogue, a scallywag, a scoundrel, somebody with low morals, especially when it came to women. Mozart's buddy was somebody who liked to live life on the edge. He loved gambling. He loved carousing. He loved drinking. He loved partying. This is not the kind of guy who's going to settle down with a wife and kids. Stadler was a party animal, and you can easily see how Mozart would have loved that. I think I might have mentioned this in a previous lecture, but it's I think a valid thing to repeat at this point in the program. Mozart, even though he wrote symphonic music and he wrote concerti and he wrote symphonies and sonatas and the like, his heart was really in the opera. And I think if we were to talk about Mozart's opera, we would want to give it its own due. I wouldn't want to try to shoehorn it into a series like this, but rather to do a full series perhaps on Mozart operas. The thing about Mozart's operas is, it brought him into the theater. And those of you who have been in the theater as performers, or perhaps as if you're working certainly on the deck crew, stagehands, people who work in any capacity in theater, or even people who attend theater, can testify to the very addictive nature of being in the theater. Mozart loved the theater. His people were theater people. That's who he hobnobbed with, mostly with actors and singers and other musicians who were associated with operatic music. Stadler was in that vein of somebody who loved to stay up late and party. And let's face it, theater people. I'm generalizing here, but I think it's a valid point to make. What do theaters and casinos have in common? Well, they don't have windows. It's very easy to get sort of bound up with whatever you're doing in the theater and lose track of time. And Mozart was castigated on more than one occasion for staying out too late with his theater buddies. Well, Anton Stadler loved to live that lifestyle, and he and Mozart were buddies. For a time, Stadler was crashing on the Mozart couch. Needless to say, Constanza Mozart, Mozart's wife, was none too pleased with this arrangement. She despised Stadler. She had a suspicion of him at first, and she came to really hate him by the end. Probably the primary reason that Constanza despised this virtuoso and pioneering clarinetist was that Anton Stadler had borrowed money from the Mozarts and had neglected to pay it back. One of the other truly roguish things that he did at the time was Stadler had asked a local clarinet maker in Vienna to make him a series of clarinets and basset horns, and he picked them up and never paid for them because the clarinet maker died. And even though his next of kin sought payment, Stadler basically said, "Hey, I don't know what you're talking about. I had an agreement with Fritz, and Fritz is dead, so sorry, can't help you." Not a good guy, like we said, and particularly when it came to his relationships with women. But nonetheless, Mozart loved him. And it's kind of easy to see why Mozart would have loved him, because Mozart could have lived vicariously to some degree through Stadler. And Mozart also greatly admired his playing. First and foremost, I think that's what brought them together. The fact that they were also members of the same Masonic lodge was the cherry on top of the proverbial sundae. So Mozart, just getting to know the clarinet, because it was a fairly new instrument, is going to write a couple of important pieces for Stadler. But the number one piece on the top of that pyramid has got to be the Clarinet Concerto in A major. It's a remarkable piece for a number of reasons. First of all, no matter how, again, amoral Stadler was, I think posterity has to be grateful for him. Because if not for Stadler, Mozart never would have written this concerto. And if not for this concerto, then there would be certainly a big hole in the repertoire of clarinet concerti that the Mozart concerto fills. In other words, even today, hundreds of, 200 plus years later, 230 years just about since the premiere of this piece, the clarinet concerto remains the go-to clarinet piece for serious clarinetists to learn when they're going to that, let's say, advanced college level, or perhaps even into graduate school. If they're taking auditions for orchestras or gigs, the Clarinet Concerto by Mozart is a piece that I would suggest most clarinetists will learn when they get to a certain level. And you wouldn't have it if not for this roguish, impish man, Anton Stadler. So yes, he borrowed money from Mozart, never paid it back. Yes, he was a rogue who slept with many women and was probably not very nice to them. Yes, he ripped off the clarinet maker. But if not for him, well, there wouldn't be this concerto. This concerto would not exist. Mozart had a profound understanding of how instruments worked all across the orchestra, but the clarinet, it should be said, was a new instrument in orchestral writing. Some of you will recall back in our first lecture when we talked about Mozart's disastrous journey to Paris. This was in September. We said that Mozart first included clarinets in the orchestra in his 31st symphony. So he's going to write 30 symphonies before he thinks to include clarinet in the mix. That's the D major symphony, the Paris Symphony from 1778. Here we're skipping to 1791, actually, to the year of Mozart's death, and we get what is considered to be the greatest of the clarinet concerti in the repertoire. There are only a handful of clarinet concerti that see regular play. This is one of them. This is the biggest of the group. The other would be a piece by none other, believe it or not, than Mozart's nephew by marriage, a guy named Carl Maria von Weber, who wrote the F minor clarinet concerto. But for the most part, um, again, when it comes to clarinet concerto repertoire, this is a very new piece. And in that sense, it's worth saying that Mozart is really pioneering new territory here in partnership in this very fruitful collaboration with the scallywag Anton Stadler. They're breaking totally new ground here and opening up the space for other instruments to be featured in the concerto format. In the 18th century, certainly by Mozart's time, it was really piano and violin. We didn't see much beyond that. But in the 19th century, we're going to have concerti written for other instruments, including cello, of course. Think of Elgar, Dvorak, Schumann, and their cello concerti, but also even viola. Certain composers like Max Bruch are going to write extensively for viola. Hector Berlioz's Harold in Italy is essentially a viola concerto. So the idea of writing for off the beaten path instruments, I think we could point to Mozart, because he wrote 4 concerti for the French horn, or what was then called the natural horn. And he's, most importantly, I think in this discussion, we're going to write the clarinet concerto. All right, got a really great performance here for you today. This is a performance by the Iceland Symphony Orchestra. And the performer's name is one of these beautiful Scandinavian names that has a lot of diacritical markings, so I'm probably mispronouncing it, but Arngur Arnadottir, I think is how it would be pronounced. So here is the Iceland Symphony Orchestra, and we begin. So in a concerto, what you'll notice is that the soloist often sits out the first statement of the theme. We call the structure of this form double exposition form in a concerto. And the exposition, of being the first part of the concerto, is going to feature the orchestra essentially stating the 2 themes, the first theme and the second theme. It's not until after those themes are stated that the soloist comes in. And ergo, we call it double exposition form, because the exposition is played twice, the first time by the orchestra and the second time by the soloist. We skip the first exposition in the D minor concerto, but here we'll listen a little bit more extensively to see how that dynamic works. All right, I'm going to pause it there. We'll wrap it up again. My friends, I invite you to listen to this music in its entirety. Recordings are available all over the place, from YouTube, obviously. If you ask your Amazon device to play any of the pieces I played tonight, either, I should say, of the pieces I played tonight, but any of the pieces I mentioned tonight, they will be in the Amazon catalog as well. So you have ample opportunity to listen to it. And again, listening to the music will do more justice to it than any words I could possibly utter. But you can hear in the finale of the concerto we were just listening to, there is a sunny quality to this music, which comes not only from the fact that it's in a major key, obviously it's in A major, as we said, but also from that bop, 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 that 6/8 dance meter, which evokes, in this case, the sort of country dances of the peasants in the outskirts of Vienna. Not that Mozart lived out there in the country, but he certainly knew folksy music, and he knew how to utilize it in his own pieces. So using dance forms in a finale is very common. Many composers do this. Mozart does it better than most. Well, let's set the stage for our our 4th and final program in the series, and then I will be happy to take your questions. What happened to Mozart at the end of this period? That is to say, the end of the 1780s and into the 1790s, when he's writing works like Clarinet Concerto and the Magic Flute's another piece he was working on, the Requiem, which we'll talk about in the next program. Some people think that Mozart experienced a steady decline in his health that somehow resulted in his death in December of 1791. That's not true. As we'll see when we reconvene, Mozart died rather suddenly. He had suffered, must be said, throughout his life from a number of different physical maladies, including, by the way, um, things that were lethal back then that he recovered from, like smallpox. If you got smallpox back then, some of you know that George Washington inoculated, uh, members of the Continental Army were forced to be inoculated against smallpox, and that some of them died because of that. Smallpox was very deadly. The way they would inoculate you back then, rather heinous to think about, is they would make a light scratch in your arm. Didn't have to be a laceration, just a scratch enough to break the top level of the skin. And then you'd find somebody with smallpox and you'd puncture a pustule and take that material and smear it into the scratch to inoculate the patient. Leopold Mozart was presented with the option of inoculating his children, and he didn't want to. The principle there, of course, is the same principle with any inoculation, that you're introducing the pathogen in a way that makes it less deadly. It makes the symptoms less severe. And so Leopold Mozart was offered that option, and he declined. And when the Mozart kids got smallpox in England, Mozart at the time was 8 years old, and he almost died. And even after recovered, he had scars on his face, which you can't see in any of the portraits which were painted, because painters were very adept in that period at glossing that kind of thing over. But nonetheless, Mozart was facially scarred, and many Europeans were, because smallpox was such a scourge. Other than that, he had had tooth abscesses and headaches and earaches and ear infections and things like that. But generally speaking, Mozart was not a chronically sick person. However, his health is going to take a turn for the worse in late November of 1791. Now, in a couple of days, it's clear that he's not ever going to get out of bed again. And Mozart himself seems to have been aware of that fact. What makes the story really weird is that in October of 1791, about 2 months before he died, Mozart was walking in the Prater, which is a park in Vienna, and he stopped and sat on a bench with his wife. And at this point, he had been working really hard on a number of pieces simultaneously. A later generation would say he was burning the midnight oil, or burning the candle at both ends. And what he said to his wife was, this requiem, Mozart's requiem that he was writing and left incomplete at the time of his death, he said, this piece is killing me. He said that in October, when he wasn't particularly sick. He may have been tired, but we have no empirical evidence, no reason to believe that he was suffering from anything that would have caused him to go see a physician. In other words, it seems to have been some sort of vision. And we get this, by the way, directly from Constanza, from his widow, who heard him speak it. Why on earth did Mozart say that? Is it plausible that the movie Amadeus gets it right, and that Antonio Salieri plotted to have Mozart poisoned? Well, many of you know that the answer to that question is no. I think the question that we probably have is, how then did Mozart die? How did he meet this untimely demise at the age of 35? And exactly, what did he mean in October when he said this piece is killing me? The fact that the Requiem was left unfinished at the time of his death, the fact that he was working on it literally on his deathbed. And in fact, there's one scene that isn't included in the movie Amadeus that played out in real life, where Mozart, after having worked out a particular section of the Confutatis movement, invited, he didn't invite, but people had come over to his house, including his old theater buddies who were with him to the end. And they read through what Mozart had written, composed at that point. And Mozart called off the rehearsal. He waved his hand. Mozart usually sang the tenor parts, and he waved his hand and started crying and said, "It's no good, it's no good." In other words, he knew at this point, this was early after he had taken to his bed, that he was not long for the world, and in fact, he wasn't. But what were the circumstances exactly that led to his demise? What role, if any, did Antonio Salieri play in this equation? Who was Salieri? Some of you are wondering. We'll talk about that in the next program. And what were the major musical triumphs of this very last period of his life? Well, I can name some of them for you today because we're going to talk about them when we reconvene in December. And those pieces would include his last two symphonies, number 40 and 41, the Requiem, of course, but mostly I would say his triumphs in this last phase of his life are in the realm of opera. And I mentioned a couple of them today, but again, I did not want to introduce operatic repertoire without giving it its proper context. And to be quite frank, discussing opera requires a significant amount of investment on the part of the audience. So I want us to be prepared for that. And therefore, when we do talk about opera, we'll make sure that it's in a specifically designated lecture where we have time to get into the Mozart operas. But in addition to Marriage of Figaro and Don Giovanni, which I mentioned, he's also going to write in this period Così fan tutte, usually translated as women are like that. It really means they're all like that, but it refers to women. And then, of course, you've got Die Zauberflöte, the magic flute, the most symbolically allegorical piece in the entire Mozart catalog, one that shows the manifold influences of Freemasonry and Masonic ideology on the composer. And that would be an interesting piece to dive into. But we are primarily going to focus on his symphonies and on his Requiem. And of course, we'll talk about the separating fact from fiction when it comes to Mozart's death, understanding as best as the scholarship currently understands it exactly what happened to this remarkable human being who died just over a month shy of his 36th birthday. I hope you've enjoyed this program on Mozart's concerti. We got to listen to the D minor concerto for piano and the A major concerto for clarinet. So for those who are keeping score and want to listen to these pieces, again, that's concerto number 20 for piano, concerto number, well, there's only one concerto for the clarinet, that's the A major. All right, let's go ahead and get to some questions. And then I will also, before I get to the questions, I want to invite everybody to a concert, really a theatrical performance that I am conducting and performing in tomorrow. It will be live streamed on YouTube. I'm going to go ahead and put the link in chat because I'm hoping that many of you will be able to tune in for that. It will be hosted on the NVCC Theater Tech website, or YouTube page, I should say. And so therefore, I'm going to put the link in chat right now. If you click this link tomorrow at 7:30 p.m., 7:30, you will get to see the Naugatuck Valley Community College Musical Theater Review Showcase, where we are bringing live theater back to campus. The performers will be unmasked and unleashed. I will be, as I said, conducting from the keyboard. We have a small pit orchestra and 11 cast members ready to entertain you with music from the show's first date and Stephen Schwartz's Wicked. So that's at 7:30 p.m. Great. Let's go ahead and take a look at these questions. Theater people do love a good party. Yes, any theater experienced theater performer knows just how addictive the theater can be. Question: what is my opinion of the very modern romantic perception of what Nannerl Mozart's life must have been like, such as whether or not she was the one who wrote his music when he was very young? Yeah, there are some questionable attributions in the early Mozart catalog. Most of that has to do with, it's not so much handwriting analysis as just, could a 5-year-old or a 6-year-old have written this? And the answer is almost certainly Mozart, in this very early inchoate phase of life, when he was 6 years old, almost certainly those early minuets were supervised by somebody, whether it was Leopold or Nannerl, who was 5 years plus his senior. It could have been either of them. But Mozart's sister, she led, I think, a very tragic life. She lived to be quite old. She lived to be, I think, into her early 80s. I believe she was 82 or something like that when she died. And most of those years were probably very unhappy. Once she and her brother split physically, that is to say, once Mozart went off to live in Vienna, this remarkable period of sibling collaboration ended permanently. And soon enough, Nannerl was married off to a widower with 5 kids of his own, who was a sort of a bureaucratic official in a town called St. Gilgens, some 6 hours carriage ride away. So she lived in a sort of backwater town with very little music. And honestly, because she was a woman, she had very few opportunities to perform after that. Imagine this, one of the most brilliant virtuosi, child prodigies in the entire continent. And then by the time she's in her 30s, she's living in obscurity, um, doing essentially nothing other than the very important and very demanding job of being a mother to 5 children that were not of her own uh, biology. That's, they were her stepkids, but she's going to produce children of her own. So she's going to have her hands full with her kids, but she's also going to become estranged from Mozart, from her brother. And that had to do with disputes about money to some degree after Leopold died and arguing over the inheritance. But mostly it just had to do with the fact that Nannerl had taken Leopold's side in some of these really big disputes between Mozart and his father. So poor Nannerl, it's a very tragic story. Had she lived in another century, she would have certainly had a remarkable career as a virtuoso concertizing pianist and perhaps even a composer. But in the 18th century, it was difficult. Let's see. Do I think it's possible that Mozart wrote himself to death trying to make the Requiem sort of his best piece? In other words, did he want the Requiem to be a sort of a piece for himself in a way? Did he feel like this was the ultimate swan song, the ultimate valedictory piece? And valedictory here from the Latin vale meaning final and dictos meaning to speak or to say something. Was this his greatest work? Well, undoubtedly, this is one of his greatest works. Whether he wrote it for himself is a tough question to answer. Certainly by November, he seems to have espoused, not just to Constanza, but to others, that this piece was killing him. And by the time he's bedridden and doing the final work on the Lacrimosa movement, at that point, he knew there was no getting up from bed. So while he still had the strength to work on it, he probably thought of it at that point as being written for himself. But no, as we'll see in December, the beginning of the Requiem starts in the summer. And at that point, I don't think he had any inkling what was ahead. Let's see. What a wonderful presentation. Thank you so much. Recently visited the Polanski exhibit. Admired 2 sheets of music next to Mozart and Beethoven. Awesome. Made you think of me. I'm so happy to hear that. Thank you so much, Christina. That is very humbling and very encouraging. My answer, I always, when people ask me what kind of music do you listen to, I always say, good music. And it's clear that the attendees at these programs share my enthusiasm for good music. So it's always wonderful to hear that. And I hope everybody will be able to join us in December when we wrap up this remarkable odyssey through Mozart's life. Question about the 11/18 performance. Yes, that's right, Sandra, it will. It will be recorded and anchored on the NBCC Theater Tech YouTube page. So we're live streaming tomorrow at 7:30. After that, the video will be available in the archive of that particular YouTube channel. So for those who can make it, it's at 7:30 p.m. And again, it's music from 2 musicals, First Date and Wicked, about 2 hours and change with an intermission. 11 cast members who have been working incredibly hard to put together a show that will feature the first unmasked singing on campus since March of 2020. We're all very excited about that. But nonetheless, for those who can make it tomorrow, wonderful, wunderbar. You can let me know what you think, either via email or when we reconvene in December, when the always excellent Darien Library hosts me for the 4th and final lecture in this series on Mozart. I want to wish everybody a wonderful night and hope to see you soon. Be well, and let's keep those ears open for great music.